Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today in Wolcottville, Indiana, and I'm joined by Duane Targgart. Duane, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
So, right out of the gate, when was the town established and how did it get its name?
Well, the name came from a gentleman, George Wollcott. George was, according to his biography, was born in Connecticut in 1805. And he evidently, his father and family were farmers. And when he was 16, he moved to Ohio, and which would have been in about 1821. And his father passed away that year, so it was up to George to take care of the farm. Mm-hmm. And so he was in a farming business until about 1828. He met a girl and got married, and they moved to another place, a farm in Ohio, and he got into started a sawmill, and also manufacturing fanning mills, which was a piece of equipment that had a crank on it that separated the grain from the chaff, and he ran that until about 1936, I guess. He sold that, and in 1937 he moved to Johnson Township, which is the north of the county line here, and started a sawmill here. Mm-hmm. And he also started a grist mill and a distillery, and that is basically the town was named after him, and it was actually laid out in 1940, I believe it was 1848. Okay. And plotted into lots and such. So that's how the name got named after Mr. Wolcott as Wolcottville, Indiana.
Very nice.
And he lived, the street is named after him. It's on the north side of town on Wolcott Street, across from a park, which was named after him, Wolcott Park, and the house is still up there.
Oh, wow.
And he had a daughter that lived, I guess, until, she may have still been living, but she sold the property in 1916 to Herb and Luella Kitchen, who, their family still owned it. They both have passed away. But the house had, after Luella passed away, the house was just left empty, and it deteriorated. And here, just a few years ago, another couple, and I can't even tell you where they're from, bought it as a historical house.
Oh, cool.
And are rebuilding it, and it's really something to see. They're really working on it and fixing it up.
Duane, you and I were talking earlier, and I always like to ask this question: has anybody famous, come out of here? So you've got a little connection as well. So
yeah, probably the one that had the most national acclaim would be a fellow by the name of Ken Kercheval, and Ken was in off-Broadway and on-Broadway programs, and he was in some soap operas, but he's best known for the part he played in the TV series Dallas, and his part he was Cliff Barnes. Mm-hmm. in the Dallas TV show, and basically my close connection, I guess you might say, through Ken was his father. His father was a doctor here in town back in the late 30s, and he was my mom's doctor when I was born. So his dad brought me into this world, I guess you could say. And Ken was back in, I believe it was 1991. We had a parade here in town, and he came back and served as the parade marshal for us.
Yeah.
In that particular parade. One other that I might mention that actually did work on the national scene was Dennis Harp. Dennis now is the executive director of the foundation for the Dawson Community College out in Glendive, Montana. But Denny was a Division I basketball coach at Hardin Simmons down in Texas. And he wrote a book here, a couple of years ago, and designated the profits from his book called All the Hoopla, I believe it was. And it's more or less, Denny had some problems when he was in elementary school here in town with one of the coaches, I guess, or something, and had some anxiety and mental problems and stuff. And he talks about how he went and got rehabilitation and went through that. And he designated the proceeds from his book to our Wolcottville Lions Club.
Oh, very nice.
Because we are a community service organization, been in town about 90 some years now. And Denny designated that, and I think we've received over $7,000 in donations for his book towards a fund that we have in his name. So the Lions Club is very active in town, has been, like I say, for 90 some years. I've been a member for 61 years, and we've done a lot in the community as far as putting up street signs, building bridges, building restrooms in the parks. One year I and two of our other members, when we were younger, mowed the park to help the town out and that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So besides having helped our local community, we also, every year now, our main projects are chicken barbecues. We cook chicken ourselves, have our own roaster, and use that for our fundraiser. And up until about 2000, and I believe it was around 2005 or so, from the time the club was chartered in 1929, we had fireworks display in our park for the community. So that was we did that for over 70 years. And one other activity that we still do, have been ever since I was small, and that is an Easter egg hunt. And we do that every year for the kids here in town. Yeah. And back in when I was a youth, it was done through the merchants. The merchants would pass out gifts, and Lions Club would give them numbers, and we'd go to the park and they'd hide eggs with a number on it, and then you had to run around town to find the business that had your prize.
Yes.
So that you got a prize. And now we still pass out numbers and stuff, but the kids come back, and actually we're getting grandkids and great-grandkids back to it from youth that did it back in my generation.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And before.
So, well, of course I love a good tradition in a community, but I also love a good story, and this next one I feel like could be a little explosive in its telling. Do you know where I'm going with this?
I think so.
All right, well, Duane, it's on you to tell us about that explosion and how it went down.
We did have a big explosion here in Wolcottville. It happened, I believe, around 1906. And I got my story from the fella that actually took part in the explosion. Howard Roy was his name. Mm-hmm. And back in after I'd gotten out of high school and I was working with my dad in our business, we had the Wolcottville Herald newspaper here in town and print shop, and we would about every morning take a break about 9:30 and go to the drugstore and have coffee. And a lot of the retired fellows would come up every morning, so we'd sit and do our chit chat and stuff. And evidently we got talking about the explosion one time, and Howard Roy was there. So the next day he came in, and when I got over there, Howard was sitting there with a picture he had of the damage that the explosion would have. And so I had to have him explain to me exactly what happened. And he explained that Howard must have been about 17, 18 at the time. Yeah. And he was working for the hardware, Sanders Hardware here in town. And they sold rifles and ammunition, and back in those days they sold buggies and a little bit of everything. So he had a fellow come in and wanted to buy a rifle, but the guy wanted to try it out. So he said, well, they'd go out behind the hardware and he could shoot at something. So Howard said when they got out there, he'd seen on the side of the building there was this knot hole on the side of the building. He told the guy there, you can see how exact it shoots, just shoot at that knot hole. Well, Howard evidently didn't realize or had forgot that on the other side of that knothole was where the hardware stored their dynamite back in those days. And the guy shot the knothole okay, and the whole building exploded. I have heard stories where windows as far north, which is about 3 blocks north, up by the school, were even blown out from the percussion. And I did ask Howard, did anybody get killed?
Right.
And he stated no, that nobody got killed, but the fellow that had shot the rifle did have a splinter from the debris come back and put his eye out. So the guy did lose his eye over the whole explosion. But yeah, I guess it was heard for miles around.
Right. Well, Duane, I understand that there was a school fire here back in the 1940s. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I certainly can. It happened actually, I looked up in one of our old Wolcottville Herald newspapers. It actually happened November 9th of 1942. And there was an explosion. And from what I've heard, it was happened in the boiler room or somewhere around that part of the school, was what I had been told. My sister, I had one sister, and she was a first grader that year. And it sounded like they had fire departments from Kendallville and different around this area come in and help them. And they, from the newspaper article, it read that they were able to, the school had been built and they'd added on just a few years before that a gymnasium, an office, and some classrooms. And the elementary part of the school is what really burnt, and they was able to save the newer part. And it had smoke and water damage, but no fire damage. So also then in the paper, I checked, and it said that in January, I believe it was, around the second or third week of January, they were going to be able to open it up again. They'd cleaned up the school. And the high school would be able to go back in there, the junior high, the elementary grades, 6th grades, lower 6th grades. Back in those days, in the early 30s, I think it was right after the Depression, 29, Franklin D. Roosevelt started an organization called the CCC, which was the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Okay.
And he started that to have young fellows, they could sign up for 6 months at a time, and it was overlooked by the Army. And they set up camps with like Army barracks, and these fellows would live there, and they built, like Pokagon Park was built by the CCC. They taught them, they were unskilled, didn't have any skills, so they taught them conservation, and so they planted a lot of trees in this area. They built parks, and at that time, in 42 or early 43, there was a camp in Kendallville, and through the help of the 4th District representative and the one of the senators from Indiana, they were able to acquire 2 of those buildings, barracks buildings from the CCC, and move them to Wolcottville for our elementary school to go in. And they were 2 buildings. They were 20 foot wide, the paper said, and 120 foot long, I think. So they was able to put partitions in those, and we had 3 rooms in each building, so we had all 6 grades in there. I went to school in those through the middle of the 5th grade year. When they added on to the previous school, they added on classrooms, and in the basement they put in a cafeteria and home ec room, I believe, was in the basement of the school. But we did have heat in each building. There were boardwalks between the two buildings because they were raised up off the ground a little bit.
Yeah.
There was only one room, which was the 1st grade room, that had running water. So every day at lunch, all 6 grades would march through the
1st grade room.
1st grade room.
That's great.
After they had got to have their break to go to the restroom, which our restrooms in our elementary school was 2 little buildings out back with no running water. And then they would come through the first grade room, wash their hands, and go back to their classroom and sit at their desk and eat their lunch. And I went to school there in those buildings until, like I say, it was, I believe, in January of '52 when we got to move into the new building.
Wow.
And that was like moving into heaven.
Yeah. I mean, seriously, the conditions you're describing right now would like never fly today.
Right.
Wow.
So there was many students here in Wolcottville. In fact, like I say, my sister would have been in the first grade, so she went in those buildings, I'm sure, for 6 years, and I went in them for about 4.5 years.
Very nice.
And but we got a good education out of it anyhow.
Yeah. Well, Duane, tell us about some of the businesses that used to be here, that are here. Talk about that.
Well, when I was growing up, our town was rather unique because we had 2 railroad tracks running through it. One running east and west, which was the Wabash Railroad, and one running north and south. In the early days was called the GR&I, Grand Rapids in Indiana, and was later taken over by Pennsylvania Railroad. And when I was a youth, our print shop was right next door to the post office on Main Street. And so my dad is part of, back in those days, the printing business. Like I say, he had a newspaper to get out once a week, but other than that, you did little printing jobs and stuff. So one of his other jobs he picked up was to go down to the railroad tracks every day, because that's how our mail come in. It would come in the morning when the train was headed to Fort Wayne, and our mail out of Kalamazoo would come in, and we'd have to go back down in the afternoon and pick it up from the train coming from Fort Wayne going back north. And what they would do, they would just slow the train down and throw the bags out on the ground, and we'd have to go down by the railroad tracks and pick up the mail bags and bring them up to the post office. So I got to, of course, to do a lot of that, as being I was raised in a print shop.
Right.
And would go down there with my dad, and the person in charge of the tower, we had a tower, which was right where the two tracks cross each other.
Okay.
He had to regulate if there was 2 trains coming about the same time. He could pull a lever up in the tower, and it would put a flag down to warn the incoming train they had to stop and wait for the other train to go. And if he had gotten a message from through the railroad that he needed to give to the engineer, he would it'd come in on his wire, and he would write a note, and he had a long stick with a loop on the end of it with a clothespin on it, and he'd put the note on that. Well, he was an older gentleman, so he'd let me run down to by side the track, and I'd have to hold that stick up, and as the train went through, the engineer would stick his arm out, and he'd get that, and then he'd pull the note off and throw the stick back down outside the train, and I'd have to run down the track and pick up the stick and take it back up to the guy in the tower. So I had a lot of jobs around town like that we did, but it was very interesting with having both tracks here in town. And it helped the business. One of our businesses back in those days that we had was we had the gravel pit here in Wolcottville, and they shipped carload after carload of sand. I guess they had some of the best foundry sand around and stuff, and so it went up to Gary by the Wabash Railroad, and so they shipped carloads of sand up to the steel mills in Gary at that time. And of course, with them being there back then in the 50s or so, it drew Reith and Riley construction, road construction company. So we had a blacktop plant here in town and everything, which created a lot of jobs. Back in those days, in the 40s, we had I guess about 5 filling stations, 2 automobile agencies. We had 3, 4 probably grocery stores, counting a small one down by the school, the Shell station. Back in the late 40s, several of the businessmen, who my dad was one of them, had set up a corporation called the Wolcottville Development Corporation. And through them, they purchased a couple properties here in town. One of them was down by the town hall over on Race Street, up here on First Street, corner of First and Race. And they built a building there and got a company that was in Ligonier called Work Garment, and they made garment working clothes, like mechanics wear and stuff like that. And the factory up here was set up with sewing machines, and the ladies would embroider the names on them and put the businesses plaques on them and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
And then they also bought property down by the railroad track down on Orange Street, which is in the south side of town here, and later developed a building down there. They got one of the Group Deco's companies called Pent Electric, and they made harnesses for refrigerators and for stoving, different kinds of wiring harnesses.
Right.
The building that Work Garment was in was then occupied after they had moved out or something. Starcraft out of Goshen set up a boat plant there, and they made boats in that plant till they had a fire, and they had a fire which burnt them out. But they had bought other buildings, one in fact on Main Street, and had added on to it. And another company come in that did fiberglass work called Rakoff Corporation. And they made hovercrafts, and they made, I think they were the company that developed for UPS their trucks. They started making a fiberglass top for the delivery trucks for UPS, which gave their drivers light inside of their their trucks that way. And another business over in that same area, a fellow by the name of John Kripe, started a pontoon company called Sullivan Pontoons, and he made pontoons there until he more or less, I guess, outgrowed that facility and moved his operation to Syracuse, where he was from. And then we got another harness company that made electric harnesses called Electric Cord Sets that come in and operated that. Since that time, those industries have sort of went by the wayside.
Yeah.
We did have two lumber companies in town, of course a grain elevator. We had a cement block plant that made cement blocks and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And we had the print shop, and our print shop, after the paper, paper was sold to the LaGrange Standard. In 1969, we stopped publishing the Wolcottville Herald and just did commercial printing. And we did a lot of commercial printing for a company called Courier Corporation, which was a national corporation. And they had a plant in Kendallville that imprinted insurance forms and such.
Oh, okay.
And we were friends of the manager there, and we started doing work for them, and which growed our business. And at one time we had 24 people working in our business. Wow. And ran 2 shifts. So I guess we were a part of the industry here in town.
Yeah.
So other than that, there's just been a lot of, we had a couple of harness shops back in those days, shoe shops. We had a dress store, men's clothing store, a furniture store, well known, a lot of Fort Wayne people. We have a lot of lakes around here, so we had a lot of traffic from the cities in the summertime.
Right.
And they would come up to the furniture store, and we had a very, very fine furniture store here in town called Patterson's Furniture Store. And other than that, we had a dry cleaner, I guess, and like I say, we had 2 automobile agencies, a Ford agency and a Chrysler Plymouth agency. And before that, I think we had a couple others. I think there was a Hudson automobile agency in town. Halls had that. So I've just seen a lot of industry come and go over the years.
Yeah. All right, Duane, any interesting buildings that you want to talk about, elaborate on?
Yeah, one that people see every time when they drive through Wolcottville here now. It's at our one and only stoplight in town. It's at the corner of the Main Street, State Road 9, and County Line. And I don't know if I did explain earlier, this is the county line out here, so we're actually in Noble County here, and across the street is LaGrange County. So we're a divided city. Actually, the town is exactly from that stoplight a half a mile each direction. So the town is actually a mile square. Yeah, a little addition to our 1 square mile was an area. The bakers owned a little apple orchard on the south side of town, and they had a grandson that they wanted to go to Wolcottville School, but he was going to have to go to Rome City since he lived out of our city limits. And so I think that the town took that area and put that in as part of the corporation. So instead of just being a mile square, we're a mile square with a little pie shape to the south, which makes it a little more than a mile.
Yeah.
1.01 or something like that, square mile of town. But as far as buildings, interesting buildings in town, the one by the stoplight up here, when I was growing up, was known as the Rarick Building. And Dr. Rarick lived in a house just south of that, where the building is there now, and he built that building as a tonsil clinic. Back in those days when there was no hospitals around here, if you had your tonsils taken out, you went in there. They had several different rooms. We went in and remodeled it. I happened to be able to purchase it, owned it for several years. Dr. Polskamp had his office in there after Dr. Rurick had left, but upstairs was, each room had its own individual bathroom because it was a tonsil clinic. They'd go in there and they'd keep them for 2 or 3 days. And the part that sticks out over the main street, when I purchased it, was all just screens and windows, and they called that the solarium, where the people that were up there could go out there and get sun while they were recovering from having their tonsils taken out.
Very cool.
And another building would be the one on the opposite corner, which the Sanders built that building. I believe it was Harry Sanders, probably his dad built it. And it was a Ford dealership, car agency. And our print shop was built right next door to that. And so we ended up with that building also as far as our part of our business in the printing business. But we had, my understanding, the most of the main brick buildings along the west side of Wolcottville up here, from the stoplight down to, there's an alley. Those are all brick buildings now. And there was a big fire that destroyed a lot of those buildings.
Wow.
And then when they got rebuilt, they did that. We've had several large fires here in town. The most recent one was probably about 4 or 5 years ago. We had where the furniture store used to be burnt down. And it's just a vacant lot up there now, so.
Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today in Wolcottville, Indiana. And hey, just wanted to tell you thanks again, Duane, for having us. Remember, travel slowly and stop often. Bye for now.